This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we'll kick off. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your time. The usual sort of opening statements here. This webinar is being recorded. It will last about 15 minutes, and it's to give you an update on all of the WhatsApp discussions and some which have happened around the edges actually over the last week. All of these slides will be shared, and this week I will do it promptly. I'll do it today. I know that there were some people who were chasing last week because we'd held off circulating them until we got the technology outreach proposal ready, but I will circulate them today. Probably not until after the webinar that's at the end of the day, so it'll be in about 8 hours time. There's a few, it's been a quieter week this week, probably because a lot of the world was celebrating Easter and people were distracted onto other things, so it's got a few less questions to look at, but nonetheless there's still quite a lot of interesting things to discuss. Here's the status of the group. So we've now got 185 organizations from 35 countries and all around the world. In fact, when you look at it, the place that seems to be missing now is Russia. So Charlotte, I think we need to find someone in Russia to join us, just so we've got a complete picture. Russia and Japan, they both seem to be standing out as not involved in this group. And then we'll be complete. So here is the agenda. We'll walk through some of the questions from the group. I'll give you an update on the technology outreach program, and then we've actually picked off a couple of recommended reads, which I think are worth going into in a bit more detail. So essentially those are the three things to cover in the next few minutes. But just before we get there, we thought it would be useful, as the world is evolving, it'd be useful to have a look at the global lockdown status of what's happening in different countries. Now, at the moment, I've got it on this slide and on the next slide where we split it into the various regions of when they went into their initial lockdown and when people are predicting that they're going to come out of their lockdown. And you can see the number of weeks that go in there. Now, the reason for sharing this is because actually I think we've got a new problem coming, which is here, summarized on this slide. And it's how we come out of the lockdown, because we're all, I think we're all acutely aware that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And the question that we're in right now is, are we at mile 2 of this marathon, or are we at mile 20? How close to the end are we? Most of us have been in lockdown now for 4 or 5 weeks, and there's beginning to be talk. We've seen Italy and Spain beginning to open up this week of the world sort of returning to some sort of normal. There's also lots of people talking about how this will lead to a resurgence, and maybe this isn't just a marathon, maybe it's one of those multiple marathons. We're going to find ourselves sort of dipping in and out of lockdown. And this made me think that there's going to be quite a lot of learning here that we could gather and share as different utilities are coming out of the lockdown. What activities are they starting up?
Absolutely.
Someone responded there, so thank you for that. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to sort of encourage everyone as we come to this next phase that we start thinking about what we can, how we can respond. Obviously, the ones to watch will be Italy and Spain as they went into the lockdown first, and they're coming out. So I'm just sharing this as a sort of point to maybe start thinking about within your organizations and on what you share with the WhatsApp group, because we were very good, I think, at sharing what people were doing as they went into the lockdown and what worked and what didn't. If we could do the same as we come out of it, would be great. I then received this overnight from Anieta in Gdansk University in Poland, who I suspect is on this call. And she shared, purely by chance, I don't think she was aware that I was going to do the who's getting locked down. She shared some sort of specific detail about what was going on in Poland. I won't try and read through this slides here, but you can see what's happened in terms of how they shut down and they tightened up the restrictions, and what within the organization, what they were doing within the water utilities, what they've done on the 25th, and then a week later on the 1st of April, as they tightened procedures. What's really quite interesting is that bit that's I've highlighted in red at the bottom, because we've had this debate on previous webinars and on the WhatsApp chat about, well, what's this doing to water consumption? And actually in Gdansk and Gdynia, which I might be pronouncing incorrectly, tourist areas, they've seen as big an increase as a 30% drop in water usage. Anyway, I thought it was a useful little case study. And again, if anyone wants to share their little case study, this was shared with me, not on WhatsApp group, it was shared via email, and you know, it was obviously more information than was practical to put into the WhatsApp issue. Now we come to the questions. So there are 4, I think, that we're going to cover today. The first one is an old favorite. It's the shortage of PPE, and in particular face masks. And you'll see at the bottom of this slide, there's the video, the YouTube video, which was shared earlier in the week around how to make a face mask using a sock and a napkin. And it was sort of very captivating. And that led to quite a bit of debate amongst people around, well, actually, you know, is this good or bad? I think the key takeaway from this is, where possible, use the right PPE, use PPE that's been properly certified and properly approved. If you haven't got PPE, then social distancing is probably as effective, and it may be better than using homemade PPE. And there's been a bit of a debate here around between various people around the pros and cons of using uncertified PPE equipment. Greg Ryan made a great point there around, you know, if it's made with cloth material, it can become moist, it can capture more of the virus. I think there was also a brilliant point made that one of the biggest risks, I think this also came from Greg, was around if you wear the wrong sort of PPE, it might actually make people overly confident, and therefore lead to people exposing themselves more. On the alternative argument is, of course, actually a cloth mask may well help reduce the ingress, and that point was made overnight about the SARS virus. It's got a 1 micron size, and most PPE masks are much bigger. The pore sizes are much bigger. What that means is that it's not removing everything. They're not 100% effective, but something is better than nothing in some cases. So yeah, there's an interesting, lively debate going on about face masks, and yeah, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. The second question came again. It's continuing debates that we've had before. It's around chlorine dosing to reduce potential contamination, and specifically around households that have got storage tanks. And I think this goes over onto 2 slides here. There was lots of debate around this, and essentially it was a strong message of, you know what, the virus is inactivated using our standard disinfection processes, and therefore we shouldn't need to overdose in chlorine for any reason. And that seemed to be a sort of universal message that was being shared from practitioners all around the world. The third question, which for some reason is, I haven't changed the numbers here, apologies for that, was around demand patterns and change in demand that we've seen as we've got into this crisis. And I've actually repeated this slide, which was shared last week, because a number of people came to me and said, can you show that graph again and just explain what that dip was? So on last week's webinar, I shared this graph, which had come from Canal de Isabel, where they'd been monitoring the water usage, and they'd seen a dip at 8 p.m. And it's a dip of about 10% in water usage, and it's actually attributed to the fact that in Italy, and we also do the same in the UK, people go outside and they celebrate the key workers, the people working in the health service, by clapping and cheering. And it's actually a great, if you've been involved with it, it's actually quite an uplifting thing to do. And it was funny to see it being reflected in the water usage graphs. Oh, funny! It was quite uplifting to see it reflected in the water usage graphs. in these dark times, we cling to anything that makes anything that feels like a good news story. This led on to a lovely piece of work which Jerry Galvin did to see around water demand, because we've now got so many people living at home, and so one would expect that there'd be increase in domestic water usage because you've got more toilet flushing, you've got more cooking and everything. You know, clothes washing will probably stay the same, but there's other things going on. So Jerry took it upon himself to measure his water usage in his house now that everyone's confined at home, and see how that compared with history. And I know it's only 1 point, it's one man and it's one data point, but it's better than no data point. And he noted that his increase, his domestic increase, had gone up by about 23%. Now, the reason I think this is interesting is because on previous webinars, we've looked at the amount of water that's being reduced by amount of consumption that's being dropped because of industry essentially being shut down. And broadly, you might recall the figure was about 9–10%. And I think last week I said, you know, when I was at Thames Water, 20% of our water usage went into industry and 80% went to domestic. And actually, industry has pretty much halved during this crisis as lots of water usage has been cut. So you'd imagine there to be a 10% drop in your total amount of water. Of course, if everybody is at home and they're using 20% more water, actually that more than accounts for the amount of water that's being lost by industry. And so this debate about what's going to happen to the water demand, of course, it's happening in different parts of the network, which is a different issue. But the total demand, it will be interesting to see how that changes once we get to the end of this epidemic, seeing what happened with that water demand. And the last question, I think I've got the numbers wrong here. I changed the order of questions. Was a debate that happened around regulators and utility interactions. And this was a question that Anna Jackson from SA Water in Australia raised. And it was specifically directed, I think, at the UK water utilities. And there was a bit of a debate taken offline here, so not under the WhatsApp chat, because there's obviously some sensitivity around these sorts of topics that people didn't want to have shared or didn't want to have aired widely. And in the UK, we've got a traditionally quite tense relationship between our regulator and the regulated. Healthily tense, I think, but it's one where there's a very clear referee and players type analogy. And Ofwat, who is the financial regulator, has specifically focused to date on what we do with our non-household, our non-domestic customers, industry basically. And they're saying that they will look at the costs and how costs might be allocated, but that will be done retrospectively once the crisis is over. And they've also, there's a letter, and you've got the link here, there's a letter that's come from the chief executive of Ofwat to all the chief executives of the water companies. And it's a one-page letter that basically says, look, you know, everybody's watching how organizations behave here, and there's a great opportunity for water utilities to show leadership. And some of that, I think we're seeing. There's some brilliant examples of where water companies are delivering, doing what they can to support the communities that they serve. And one of my favorite examples, which I'm sure they won't mind me sharing, is Northumbrian Water has made a very early statement that its small suppliers, they weren't going to hold them to the usual payment terms, but they would ensure that cash was flowing out to them and support them quickly, which is actually, if you're a small business, cash is king, and that sort of thing becomes incredibly important. So those were the questions that were picked up this week. Hopefully you found that interesting. The two other things I'd like to cover is I'd like to give you a quick update on the technology outreach program, and then we'll talk for a couple of minutes about the recommended reads. So on the technology outreach, for those of you who weren't on the webinar last week, before Easter, ISLE took it upon ourselves to do a bit of an outreach to 2,500 companies to see what technology solutions might be there to help utilities through this crisis, both in terms of detecting the COVID virus and removing it and deactivating it. Obviously, we don't need to remove and deactivate it in the water treatment systems, because I think we're confident that that works, but in other parts of the of society. And then there's quite a lot of work on remote monitoring and control. That led to interest in having a more detailed study, which would identify more of the solutions and do a wider horizon scan. And I circulated a proposal which we've shared, which we're basically proposing the costs would be shared amongst a large number of utilities, with a target start date of essentially this time next week. I thank you for those of you who've responded back positively on that. We haven't yet got enough organisations signed up to kick this off. And if I could just ask that if you're interested in this, please could you drop me or Charlotte an email confirming that you'd be up for getting involved. Here's the slide that summarises the an overview of what's involved in the project. I'm not going to talk through it now, but essentially it is 4 global horizon scans that will identify, verify, and present all the available solutions across those 4 criteria. And it would be a really useful project, I think, to sort of share around the wider community. There's a few unanswered questions, and I saw that there was a couple interesting ones that came up overnight as well. And I think in particular, there's a second question here around remote technology and the use of that as to how people are going to take that forward. So if you can consider that, that would be useful. And then finally, we come to the recommended reads. Sorry, you can't see it on your screen, but I've got the GoToMeeting stuff, which is blocking what's actually on my screen. So I'll just move that. So there are 2 recommended reads here. The first one comes from the World Bank, and it's on their water. It's a WASH, water sanitation and hygiene document around WASH and COVID-19. And they basically identified 3 priority areas. The first 2 of them aren't relevant to utilities. One's around healthcare and the other is around hygiene and hand washing. But area 3 was specific to water utilities, and it's obviously this is focused on developing country. Sorry, can I ask you put yourself on if you're not on mute already, or Charlotte, if you can control who's on mute, could you do that for me? So we've got this document that shows basically it highlights the key priorities for the different water provision service in these communities, and it's essentially working all the way through from point of use applications and then providing some financial support. The other key read that we'd recommend you looked at is this one from the American Waterworks Association. And they approached all of their members. They approached about 600 organizations. So this has been a good survey. And the sort of takeaways here is that essentially everyone, 97%, are keeping their essential services running, which I think is a great endorsement of how the water sector is coping. You know, essentially everyone, bar a tiny percentage, are keeping all of their essential services going. Also, pretty much everyone, 95%, have had to adapt. They've had to shift their working practices, which again, I think is a bit of good news there. We're an industry that's often referred to as sort of being stuck in the mud and not able to adapt. And we're showing through this crisis that we can adapt. Most, 75%, are expecting absentees. Most are expecting PPE shortages. And most, 64%, are expecting to incur cash flow issues as they see clients unable to pay them. That is countered by the fact that actually only 10% so far have seen reductions in their revenues, which is what's seen on this this first bullet point here. So it's a really interesting read as a sort of survey of where do water utilities feel they are. And I encourage you that it might be worth reading, because if you're an outlier from those, then something's probably wrong. If any of those sort of stats that I've just shared with you, you feel jolt with you, then it would suggest that maybe you're in a different place. Then finishing, we've obviously got the usual links to resources here. There's a really good website here that shares the pandemic simulations for 150 countries around the world. So you've actually got them locally. It's a piece of work done by the University of Oxford that we think could be worth going to. Well, I haven't got the time to go into these different links, but you can read them here. There's lots of links which are worth picking up on if that's of interest to you. So my final slide is the one around next steps. So there are two things I'd like you to take away from this today. One is that we're going to circulate a Google Docs survey to help identify some of the problem areas and solutions. If you could take 1 minute to fill that in, and then if we get that data, I'll share that next week, and it'll give us our own little perspective on what's going on. And also, if you're interested in doing the tech outreach horizon scan, if you could let me know by the 24th of April, or as soon as possible, really, then we can make sure that that project can kick off. The next webinars will be next Tuesday at 7:30 in the morning, i.e. this time, and at 4:30 p.m. British Summer Time in the afternoon. With that, I'll just pause in case anyone's got any questions. I'll pull up and see if there's anything on the chat. And with that, I'll wish you all the best, and hope to speak to you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.